The F-16 Fighting Falcon is a true 4th generation fighter featuring peerless sustained turn rate, incredible power to weight ratio, and unmatched maneuverability. This is thanks to its groundbreaking fly-by-wire system that allows carefree handling of the plane at all angles of attack, and unlike its predecessors, it is a true 9G capable airframe. Due to its unmatched kinetic performance, multi-role capability, and low operating cost, the F-16 Fighting Falcon will be the premier light fighter aircraft of the late 20th century. Okay, I can't do it anymore. I am once again here to talk about War Thunder flight models. Namely, I'm here to talk about aerodynamics instability, fly-by-wire limitations, and super maneuverability. In this discussion, I'm going to cover topics of realism within War Thunder's simulated environment and their ramifications for gameplay in the simulator mode, as well as carryover effects into the realistic game mode. For the sake of brevity, because this is going to be a very long video, I am going to assume that you're at least somewhat familiar with both of the game modes, but for those that wander here from outside of the War Thunder space, the simulator mode is designed to more closely mimic real-life conditions through the use of stick and throttles, and kind of centered around that kind of core idea, as well as forced cockpit view. While realistic mode has semi-realistic flight models, but you have external view and the plane is controlled through the use of a mouse with something called quote-unquote mouse aim. Now, before we even get into that, we actually have to start from the beginning. In my little 1970s promotional act for the F-16, I threw in a bunch of jargon, a lot of fluff phrases that sound impressive, but are ultimately meaningless to the audience. It's kind of an intellectual bait and switch of creating a feeling of being informed without actually being informed. So before I even start with War Thunder, I want to decode some of the terms and some of the ways that I am going to be using them. This whole video is going to be talking about 4th generation fighters in War Thunder, by the way. It's going to stray from that and it's going to get back to it. And that is all well and good, but before we even get into that, we need to talk about some terms that may be useful and whether or not 4th generation fighter is even a useful term for this discussion. In very broad terms, 4th generation fighters are basically the series of fighter planes that placed a greater emphasis on all-around performance instead of pure interceptor performance and pure kind of speed climb, time to intercept based metrics. By the Wikipedia definition, 4th generation fighters include things like aerodynamic efficiently designs, increased maneuverability, relaxed stability, fly-by-wire controls, synthetic radar, and thrust vectoring. In extremely broad terms, you could think of the 4th generation fighters as starting with planes like the F-14 and the MiG-29, and ending with planes like the Eurofighter, Rafale, and Sukhoi 35. But Squish, the Eurofighter is actually a 4.5 generation fighter. You are clearly uninformed and you cannot fathom the superiority of the trianguloid configuration. Sit down, dude. Nobody cares. For the sake of our discussion, there are no 4.5 generation fighters because the things that distinguish 4.5 generation fighters from 4th generation fighters is largely limited to software and hardware that are stuffed into the airframe. And before you go getting upset in my comments about this whole thing, that I'm not giving your special plane all the credit that it is due, let me highlight some of the shortcomings of defining jet aircraft by generation. If we go back to our Wikipedia definition, we have to ask ourselves, at what point does 3rd gen become 4th gen? Is our reference points going to be the change in airframe design emphasis? Is it a change in doctrine? Or is it going to be the integration of fly-by-wire controls? What defines 4.5 over 4? Does it need to have some stealth features in the airframe? Does it need to have an electronically scanned, quote-unquote, synthetic radar? How many TV screens does the plane need to have to be considered truly modern? Does it need all of the above, none of the above, some of the above? Where is that point? Just to put things in perspective, the 4th generation of fighter design incorporates essentially the past 50 years of non-stealth fighters. That is going to be if we consider the F-14 to be the first true 4th generation fighter. To add a further sense of scale to this, the first 3 generations of jet fighters only encompasses 30 years of around 1945 to 1975. But what makes the F-14 a 4th generation fighter? The only good argument that can be made is from an airframe design emphasis and emphasizing more balanced performance. Doctrinally speaking, the F-14 is a fleet defense fighter with an emphasis on destroying bombers from beyond visual range before they can get within range of a carrier task force. In a lot of ways, its employment emphasis is a doubling down on and a perfection of third generational fighter doctrine. In practice, the F-14, because it is the first of the fourth generation fighters, lacks a lot of the other design features that would be later incorporated into aircraft. The F-14 is not designed with relaxed stability, and it does not incorporate a fly-by-wire system. Neither does the F-15 or the MiG-29. There is an argument to be made that all of these fighters represent a transition between third and fourth generations. I think the most eloquent way to put this is that in respect to design, in respect to flight performance and design emphasis, these are all clearly fourth generation aircraft. But the actual implementation is done through third generational means. Now, before I get into the meat and potatoes of the video and talk about the video game, I would like to go over a timeline of things that I consider to be significant when it comes to understanding fourth generational airframes, just so that we are all well and truly on the same page. This also gives me a chance to nerd out about some airframe developments as well as a little bit of missile development, because I am throwing that in there to kind of add a greater context to the universe that War Thunder exists in. I'm also cutting out some stuff. I'm not adding a lot of data link systems and how data link has evolved over time, or when true data link comes into existence, and how Soviet data link is doctrinally different than American data link, because actually tracking all that information down is a whole entire research project unto its own right, and just doesn't really have a lot of merit for the direction that this discussion is going to go, which is mainly emphasizing relaxed stability, plane performance, and the way that plane performance works in War Thunder. Now, our timeline is going to start in 1974 with the very tail end of the Vietnam War and the F-14 entering service. In 1976, the F-15 would enter service with the U.S. Air Force, and in 1977, the MiG-29 would enter service with the Soviet Air Force. These first three planes represent kind of our first wave of fourth generation fighters, where they are still using hydraulically controlled mechanical systems. It really is not until 1980, with the introduction of the F-16, that we have our first unstable airframe with fly-by-wire controls. That is followed up in 1983 with the Mirage 2000 and the F-18. On the missile development spectrum, it isn't until 1983 and 1984 that the R-27ER enters service and the R-73 enters service. So there's a period of time where the MiG-29 is in service, but it does not have the R-27ER, and it does not have the R-73 with that high off-bore sight, helmet-mounted sight capability. In 1985, the Soviets finally catch up to the relaxed stability craze, and the Su-27 enters service. The Su-27 is the Soviet Union's first fly-by-wire system, and it's notable in the aspect that it is the first production fighter that is capable of the full spectrum of what is called supermaneuverability, which is basically the plane being able to control itself beyond stall conditions. At the same time, America starts their own programs to examine the applicability of supermaneuverability in the form of a bunch of different thrust vectoring prototypes, and testing out, like, does it actually matter? What kind of edges do you get from having a supermaneuverable airframe? And this gives us, in 1987, we end up with the F-18 Harv, which is a thrust vectoring F-18. It's the NASA one that everyone has seen. 1988, you end up with the F-15 Active. This was done to kind of examine the feasibility of taking off of bombed-out airfields, take off shorter distances, but also increase the overall maneuverability performance of the plane. In 1990, Rockwell comes out with the X-31. This is a joint project between Germany and the United States to examine thrust vectoring, supermaneuverability, and the long-coupled canard configuration on an airframe. This plane looks like a baby Eurofighter. Shouldn't be surprising that the Eurofighter ends up looking very similar to the Rockwell X-31, and that the Germans would be advocating that the Eurofighter should have had thrust vectoring. Also in 1990, we have the F-16 MAT-B, which stands for multi-axis thrust vectoring, basically fitting an F-16 with a thrust vectoring nozzle and examining what kind of problems that creates and what kind of problems it solves and whether or not it's relevant. In 1991, the AMRAAM-A enters service, and in 1991, a really big thing that kind of puts a damper on fighter development worldwide is the Soviet Union collapses. And because the Soviet Union collapses, the gigantic nuclear war that everyone is preparing for is not going to happen. So research and development on fighter planes is going to slow down because obviously the big bad guy that everyone was worried about is not there, and we don't have the superpower race anymore. Just because the Soviet Union collapses, though, doesn't mean that everything stops. There's going to be a slow degradation, a slow drawing back of requirements. Things like the Eurofighter, because of the Soviet Union collapse, adding thrust vectoring to it is not going to be as much of a priority, and some of those design requirements are going to get shifted. In 1992, the R-77 debuts at the Max Air Show, but according to Wikipedia, the R-77 development is not fully completed until 1994. If we're luxurious and we assume in a world where the Soviet Union didn't collapse, the R-77 goes into service probably around 1994, 1995 in limited numbers. But that just kind of gives you a perspective of, like, America has the AMRAAM-A for about 4 or 5 years before the Soviet equivalent would come into, basically go into service if things had not changed. In 1993, the Gripen enters service. This is the first coupled canard configuration, relaxed stability, 4th generation Euro canard fighter that actually enters service. And in 1994, the Eurofighter gets its first test flight. 1995 is a pretty important thing as far as the avionics stuff is concerned. This is kind of a transition between early 4th gen and later 4th gen because Mitsubishi tests out the F2 with the aptly named JAP G1 AZA radar. So this is our first electronically controlled scanned radar. The new radar stuff doesn't really matter for our discussions, but this just gives us a kind of like a benchmark. Like, hey, 1995, electronically controlled radar becomes like a thing. So this is probably where we can start thinking about terms like 4.5 generation. In 1996, the Russians test fly the Su-37. This is the canard flanker with thrust vectoring, and it really isn't until 1998 that America finally starts to catch up to that high off-bore sight helmet-mounted sight capability that the Soviet Union already had with the JHEMX, the helmet-mounted sight thing. The JHEMX is a helmet-mounted display, so it displays more stuff. It's more useful, but at the same time, America, pretty much everyone, is kind of soldiering on with the AIM-9M. In 2002, the first batch of R-77s is finally delivered. So the R-77, even though it's done in 1994 because the Soviet Union has collapsed and we're not worried about nuclear war anymore, doesn't go into service until 2002. So you have like a gigantic lag time, but you still have some stuff in the background in the former Soviet Union that's still going on. And in 2003 is when things kind of like really change. And it's not really that they really change dramatically, because obviously this stuff is going on in the background as research projects, and because the AIM-9X entered service in 2003, that doesn't mean that it couldn't have been done sooner if the research and development was more prioritized, but obviously no Soviet Union means no budget to do that. But the 9X enters service in 2003, the Eurofighter enters service, and in 2005, the F-22 enters service. At the same time, in 2005, the Iris-T enters service. So it really isn't until the early 2000s that this high off-bore sight capabilities, new modern IR missiles, go into service. And the new modern IR missiles are a pretty substantial leap over even things like the R-73, just due to the changes in seeker head technology, the missile capabilities, and just the fact that they are a lot harder to get rid of. The ability to fire over the shoulder, behind you, use different data systems to target the missile, it becomes a lot more viable, a lot more common, and really it's kind of the early 2000s is when, from a tactical perspective, you're going to say that BFM dogfighting as kind of a thing just dies. And it doesn't really die in the sense that Air Forces don't practice it anymore. They practice it because the exercise is worth the training value for it, but from a doctrinal perspective, a lot of the stuff that centers around that now goes, we're both going to go into the merge, we're going to shoot each other, and it's like a knife fight now where the guy who wins just bleeds out and dies later. That kind of thing. In 2013, we finally get to Russia's new fighter, which is the Su-35. And in 2015, we're going to end it at 2015 with the Eurofighter Aerodynamics Modification Kit test flight. Because this kind of like really kind of caps off that even though increasing the maneuverability of fighters did change and was examined in the 1990s, and because of the fall of the Soviet Union was kind of looked at and goes, we don't really need it. The missile technology has caught up to it. In 2015, the Europeans are still looking at adding not super maneuverability, but increasing the flight envelope, especially with asymmetric weapons load, especially at higher angles of attack and slower speeds for the Eurofighter, because even though things have changed, there are still situations where increased maneuverability could prove to be a decisive advantage. Now that we have a nice warm and fuzzy feeling over fighter aircraft development for the past 50 years, and someone who has very acute attention to detail is correcting all of my dates in the comments as we speak, and I have sidetracked the conversation with a 15-minute long tangent. This is why I don't do scripts. Let's go into 2 more tangents before we really talk about the video game. The first thing to talk about are the 2 things that set the F-16 apart from its predecessors, namely relaxed stability and fly-by-wire systems. And after that, we're going to transition into a discussion about super maneuverability eventually. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to assume that you understand that wings produce lift and lift makes planes fly. I'm also going to assume that you know that when the wing stops flying, it's called a stall, and this is generally considered bad. This is not your private pilot's introduction to aerodynamics course, but let's borrow a description of stability and then break plain English, get it, airplane, into plain English, like, you know, a plain bagel, get it? Ha 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 ha, we're humorous here. Anyways, getting into the definition. Stability in flight dynamics refers to the ability of the aircraft to maintain or return to particular flight condition after being disturbed by an external force or forces. Static stability is the initial tendency of an aircraft to return to its original attitude. Positive static stability means the aircraft returns to its original flight condition. And neutral static stability means it stays in the new condition. Negative static stability means it moves further away from its original condition and attitude. Dynamic stability refers to the aircraft's behavior over time following a disturbance, which, in many cases, is an oscillatory response. For example, a disturbance in pitch may cause the dynamic response to consist of a series of nose-high and nose-down pitching motions. Positive dynamic stability means the oscillations will decrease in amplitude and return to their original condition. Neutral dynamic stability means the oscillations will remain constant in amplitude, and negative static stability means that they will increase in amplitude. Nerd speak. In normal people terms, this means that a stable aircraft is going to be designed with positive static and dynamic stability. Basically, that an aircraft will be weighted so that it's nose heavy, so that when the plane stalls, it will point the nose down, which will get air flowing over the wings in the correct direction again, and get it flying again. This is generally considered to be a design feature that is good to have. However, stability comes at a cost, and that cost is performance. Essentially, because the plane always wants to point its nose down, the elevator must be counteracting that force and lifting the nose up just to get the plane to fly straight and level. This causes drag, and, well, drag is a drag, and it robs performance. At the same time, this front-heavy tendency means that in order to lift all of that weight in the front and throw it around in a dogfight, you need a relatively large elevator. Also keep in mind, the center of lift and pressure will also change with speed and attitude. All of these things mean the plane is doing a bunch of things at one time, and that's just to say that the stability values are not always fixed in place in time. So what happens when you reduce the stability of the plane? What happens when you take all of that weight that's out in the front and you move it towards the middle and move it basically towards what you consider kind of like its center of gravity, kind of its pivot point? Well, it means it takes less force to fly the plane, and that smaller control surface deflections will cause more movement and more rapid movement because the plane is balanced in such a way that it basically wants to fall over at any one time. The downside is that the plane becomes basically unflyable. Doing something as simple as pitching the plane up is no longer a simple elevator deflection in one direction. Instead, it's a three-step movement where the elevator has to be deflected in one direction to lift the nose, which will cause the plane to want to pitch up and tip over backwards. So then the elevator has to be pitched down in the other direction to retard and cancel out the pitching momentum, and then it is stabilized in the middle. It has to be timed perfectly correctly in order to just not cause the pitching momentum to cause the plane to flip over and go the other direction and stall. Now, if this actually makes no damn sense to you, the best way to see this in action is to watch airshow demonstrations from fighter jets, because oftentimes you can pay attention to the control surfaces and you can see the way that they work in action. And initially in the video I intended to show that, but a lot of those videos are copyrighted, and this is a good time to segue into what makes all of this possible. And this is artificial stability through fly-by-wire systems. This is the second half of the equation that makes it even possible for planes with relaxed stability margins or negative stability margins even possible to fly. Essentially what a fly-by-wire system does is feed the pilot's inputs into a computer and then translates it into control surface inputs that will allow the plane to exhibit all of the positive characteristics of an aerodynamically stable plane. The best way to think of a fly-by-wire system is something of a governor on a car. Not only does it make the plane flyable, it allows the plane to get the maximum amount of performance at any one time, but it also comes with limitations. Just because the fly-by-wire system can make something fly that would be impossibly hard to fly otherwise, does not mean that it can make things that can't fly, fly. And this is where the back end of fly-by-wire systems comes into play. This is where we need to talk about limiters. Aside from making the plane flyable, the other function of the flight computer is to prevent the plane from becoming unflyable. Because a stall in a plane that is not aerodynamically stable means that it is not necessarily going to want to point the nose down. And just because the computer can anticipate what to do with the control surfaces to make the plane flyable doesn't mean there isn't a limit to what amount of instability that the plane and the flight computer can counteract. For instance, if an unstable aircraft was to pitch up too quickly and build up too much momentum, where a negative control surface deflection could not stop it, it would continue up over backwards, stall, and then probably fall out of the sky. And this is where we need to talk about the F-16, because as the first unstable aircraft, and because most of the information around it is declassified, we can afford to talk about it and not have the feds come kicking in my door. Attached on your screen, I have an analysis from the Israeli Air Force on the F-16 flight control system, and I think the first page or so does give a decent representation of what the flight control system does. Now, instead of reading the whole thing verbatim, I am just going to highlight some of the parts that are relevant to our discussion in order to keep things rather brief. So starting off, we're going to skip the abstract and go to the introduction. Introduction. Full control augmentation as implemented on the General Dynamics F-15 and conceivably in most future combat aircraft provides for exceptional flying qualities and, theoretically, departure-proof flight. Extensive testing and operational experience have proven, however, that the flight control system limiters, which operate to keep the aircraft within the controlled flight envelope, can be broken. As a result, departures from controlled flight may occur. Engineering changes, manual pitch override, rudder fade out, and operating limits, airspeed and maneuver, have been used as a remedy to prevent departures or at least permit automatic or manual recovery. This is all just to say that even within its limitations, there were still combinations of control inputs that would cause the F-16 to depart flight, and that some solutions were implemented to prevent this or at least mitigate this risk. Now, for those that do not know, one of the critical limitations for the F-16 is its 25 degrees angle of attack limit, where if it exceeds this limit, it has a tendency to enter what is called a deep stall. For the sake of our discussion, we're just going to say that a deep stall is one that takes too much time to recover from and in general terms is very, very bad. The implementation of manual pitch override basically grants the pilot the ability to increase the total negative elevator deflection in order to eventually get the nose pointed down and airflow over the wings and return the plane to a flyable condition. Anyways, let's skip ahead to section 2 with the flight control augmentation system. The F-16 flight control system was designed to provide the flexibility to achieve the goal of truly eyes out of the cockpit maneuvering in the combat arena. The performance goal established for the flight control system was to provide maximum performance in terms of usable lift and roll rate for maximum command, thereby achieving maximum combat effectiveness. Several unique high angle of attack enhancement features, such as the AoA/G limiter, roll rate limiter, rudder authority limiter, and the aileron to rudder integration (ARI), were incorporated into the flight control system. These features were designed to provide high level of departure resistance throughout the air combat maneuvering envelope. The angle of attack G limiter is designed to prevent the pilot from maneuvering the aircraft beyond its maximum allowable AoA to avoid longitudinal departures. The pilot command is reduced as the AoA increases as a function of roll rate, as illustrated in Figure 1. This is all just a really professional way of stating how the fly-by-wire system and its limiters are designed to work in conjunction with each other to keep the plane flying. The big takeaway from this is that as the plane reaches one limit, it reduces the limits on the other control surfaces. For instance, if we look at Figure 1 and at Figure 3, you can see that the available roll rate and amount of rudder deflection available will decrease as angle of attack increases. And the purpose of doing this is to prevent the plane from entering a condition where the control surfaces and the computer are not able to sufficiently counteract the momentum of the plane that would cause it to depart flight. Now, I am not going to continue reading off of the paper. I think we do have a nice general idea of how relaxed stability and fly-by-wire systems work. And for those that are interested, that paper will be linked in the description. But we need to talk about War Thunder and how these limitations are implemented within the game or not implemented, and what kind of creative liberties are taken. The first thing to understand is that there is not a singular control limit in War Thunder. There are actually 3 different control schemes and 3 different limitations. There is the instructor limit, the SAS damping limit, and the SAS manual limit. You could also argue that using trim to exceed the manual limits would constitute a 4th scheme, but it's a distinction without merit. And it's because of this that only some aspects of unstable flight are kind of sort of approximated, as well as those of the flight control system. In practicality, this means that it is easily possible to exceed all sorts of realistic and documented limitations, and this goes beyond the simple 1.5 times operational G limit that War Thunder uses for all of its airplanes. For instance, in-game, the F-16 does not see a significant degradation of its roll and rudder authority at high angles of attack. Now, is this actually a bad thing? The answer is, well, it depends. From a fidelity and accuracy perspective, it undermines the quality of the simulation. From a gameplay perspective, it is one of the largest contributing factors to the feel of the game and makes it actually playable, especially in the game modes that people actually play. War Thunder would not feel like War Thunder at all if it had realistic implementation of flight control limitations. Let me explain. Back in the good old days, when the F-16A was introduced to the game, Gaijin did try to approximate the G-limiting function of the FCS. And what this essentially meant for AirRB gameplay is that the plane was flying around in a constant state of elevator compression at around Mach 1. The F-16A could zip around all day and maintain energy, but when it comes to the ability to actually aim at the speeds that everyone flies at, it was worse than a plane like the F-104 that in-game can rip around at high speeds, do a quick 13G turn at supersonic speeds, and get its guns on target. It meant that the Vulcan was a lot more usable at the speed ranges that people normally started the fight at. And the G limiter is only a small part of what the real flight control system does. Remember those charts that I showed earlier where the plane loses possible control authority at higher angles of attack. Imagine if the F-16 became incredibly sluggish and non-responsive except for a single axis when you're stomping the S key in AirRB. This would create a situation where the plane would essentially be unaimable in AirRB. And this is something that the developers themselves have stated when people have asked for a full range of F-16 FCS limitations to be implemented. And the issue here as it relates to gameplay isn't just that realism creates worse gameplay, but also that selective realism is very bad for gameplay, or at least it's very jarring for gameplay. In order to further explain this, we are going to have to take a quick detour to props in order to talk about the dangers of selective loss of control authority / limiting control forces based on realism. And for this comparison, I'm going to be comparing the F8F-1 with the N1K-2. Now, on paper, the F8F is the fastest prop plane in the game, and performance-wise, absolutely clobbers the N1K-2. But I would argue that in AirRB, the N1K-2 is a far more pleasant plane to fly, and that the F8F has been effectively kneecapped due to selective realism. In theory, due to its high speed and high climb rate, the F8F should be extremely threatening as a boom and zoomer. At the same time, the abysmal flight performance of the N1K-2 should make it borderline unplayable. But in-game, the F8F has a critical fault, a critical design failure, and it is purely a design failure that exists because the documentation for American planes is much more thorough and readily available than late war Japanese planes. This core design failure is that the rudder loses control authority at high speeds. The high speed of the airflow makes the rudder harder to deflect, and the pilot is not able to generate enough force to swivel the nose. This is a form of high-speed control compression. This form of high-speed control compression is something that would have been universal to all World War II aircraft, and one of those things that wouldn't have necessarily been documented because it falls under the column of, well, no duh. But that is not the way that War Thunder treats it. Essentially, what sets the N1K apart from the F8F is that it maintains much more of its control authority at high speeds, especially in the rudder. And because of this, it will have a much easier time following the cursor and mouse aim. Or inversely, what sets the F8F apart from most props in the game is the degree of realism that the flight model is treated. And because of this, there are very negative consequences for gameplay. Not only is the F8F-1B working with a set of limitations that do not apply to most other aircraft in AirRB, but so is the F8F-1. And while the 1B can be carried by having instant kill guns, the 450 cals on the regular Bearcat means that it needs to hit a far higher number of shots, and it simply cannot. And because it cannot aim, it has been a consistently poor performer, and it has been bumped all the way down to 4.7 battle rating, where it outperforms everything by even greater margins, but is still forced to work within the same set of limitations. This creates a situation where the plane is simultaneously overpowered in performance terms, but is also nearly unusable for most of the player base. And really, the only way to fix this problem is to either remove the rudder compression and make the flight model less realistic, or add rudder compression and control surface compression to all other prop planes across the board and make all of the flight models realistic, or to ignore the cause of the problem and continue to down-tier the plane. Gaijin has chosen the latter. The first solution is probably the most amicable to most of the player base and the common sense one. The second one would satisfy all of the full fidelity LARPers that want everything to be as abysmal dogshit in mouse aim as it was in real life. And the third one makes nobody happy. Anyways, I think that you are smart enough to understand the point, so let's get back to our 4th generation unstable flight models and how realistic they are in War Thunder. And the very short answer is that they're not realistic at all. The more in-depth answer is that it really depends on what limits you are using, because the instructor limit is different from the damping limit, which is different from the manual controls limit. And in practical terms, just beyond the normal allowances that Gaijin makes for gameplay sakes, planes that are unstable like the F-16, Eurofighter 2000, and the Rafale see huge increases in available G at high speeds and available angle of attack at low speeds. In terms of gameplay, this is not especially important for Air RB or Air Arcade, but when it comes to sim battles and when it comes to 1 versus 1 engagements in sim battles, it can become especially jarring. Engaging manual controls in the F-16 will expand the available angle of attack from 25 degrees maximum all the way up to 40 degrees. Technically, if you rock the nose up and down, you can attain even higher angles of attack, but I'm not really counting that as the limit. I'm counting that as kind of like a gamesmanshiping of the limit. To put things into perspective, the available AoA with a change to manual controls more or less allows the F-16 in-game to mimic about 60 to 70% of what the multi-axis thrust vectoring F-16, one of those programs from the 1990s that was studying the utility of thrust vectoring and super maneuverability. The Eurofighter is another plane that has a fairly well-documented angle of attack limit. According to the Royal Aeronautical Society magazine Aerospace, the angle of attack of the Typhoon is limited to around 24 degrees. This claim originates in an article that is an interview with EADS test pilot Chris Warning, and this claim is backed up by multiple pilot interviews who will claim that the one weakness of the Eurofighter is that it is not exceptional at low speeds. EADS, the company that produces the Eurofighter, ended up developing the aerodynamics modification kit to increase the capability of the plane at low airspeeds, high angles of attack, and differing weapons configurations. And according to their own interviews, the increased available angle of attack for the AMK-equipped plane is around 45% at low speeds, with a 100% increase in roll rates. In order for this to make sense, let's just take a moment to remember what we learned earlier with the Israeli study about flight control systems. As angle of attack increased, the authority of other control surfaces were reduced. So what is happening here is not that peak roll rate is being increased, but rather a reduction in the amount of roll rate that you will lose at higher angles of attack. When engineering nerds talk about increasing the agility of an airplane, what they are talking about is the ability of the plane to quickly change directions. In real life, the AMK is a substantial upgrade for the Eurofighter that increases its allowable flight envelope in pretty much every single configuration. Not only are AMK-equipped planes more capable with the quote-unquote new flight envelope, they would also have much better performance in the existing flight envelope by virtue of being able to safely reduce the limitations of the flight control systems. This is especially true when the plane is configured in ways that are not optimized for pure air-to-air combat. However, the version of the Eurofighter that we have in the game is not equipped with the aerodynamics modification kit. The Eurofighter that we have in game right now does not have a 24-degree angle of attack limit. The Eurofighter that we have in game right now has an SAS damping limit of 29 degrees, which is the same as the Rafale and the Mirage 2000. Its manual limit is right around 50 degrees before it starts to depart flight. But 90 degrees AoA can be safely attained and recovered from with smart control inputs. Basically, in-game, you can actually do a Cobra in manual controls by pitching up to around 45 AoA and then pitching down. The momentum that you build up will carry the plane all the way to 90, and you will be able to recover that before entering a spin. However, this recovery is not automatic and is something that requires timing. If the plane builds up too much momentum, or the nose is carried beyond 90 AoA, it will try to fly backwards, it will spin, and will likely crash itself out. Now, this pitch up and then pitching down to retard the plane's momentum should sound very familiar at this point. It should sound just like the description of the F-22 taking off. This means that in some sense, Gaijin is at least attempting to mimic unstable aircraft behavior. However, the Eurofighter within the game is aerodynamically capable of almost a full range of super maneuverability. It is actually conceivable that a third-party developer could make their own software to govern control inputs based on flight data that is output by War Thunder's local host. Imagine for a second if there was a program that checked the AoA of the plane, calculated the pitch and momentum of the plane, and then automatically input the negative control surface deflection at the correct time to prevent the plane from departing flight. Maybe this third-party program would also utilize two different modes, where one mode has turning profiles and control inputs that are optimized for turning efficiency, and another mode that is optimized for turning radius and high angle of attack. Congratulations, we just made an actual flight control system to effortlessly fly the plane to its in-game aerodynamic limits. We also just made a cheat. Surprisingly, the only Western fighter in the game that has a somewhat well-implemented angle of attack limit is the JAS-39 Gripen. Even in manual controls, the plane is not capable of exceedingly high angles of attack like the F-16 Eurofighter or Rafale. It really is not until you start making belligerent control inputs with negative G rudder that some unrealistic things will begin to happen in relation to indicated angles of attack. It's also because of this phenomenon that when the Gaijin developers say that implementing some form of flight control system limitations will brick mouse aim, that I do not take those claims completely at face value. I do think that there is truth to the fact that if flight control systems were fully implemented where you did lose rudder authority and you did lose aileron authority at low speeds, that yes, the planes would become unaimable in mouse aim. However, the current Gripen implementation shows that an angle of attack limitation in manual controls and damping controls is not going to have any perceived negative effects in mouse aim. So what impact does this have on gameplay? Well, for sim gameplay, this means that many planes in the game have what is effectively pseudo super maneuverability. It means that they have low speed controllability and capabilities that they would otherwise not have in real life. This can be facilitated mainly through the use of manual controls. In the grand scheme of missile slinging gameplay, where most players never make it to the dogfighting portion, this has completely negligible effects. However, it also means that the whole entire playbook, once you enter a dogfight, is fundamentally different and unique from their real-life counterparts. So how is this playbook altered? Well, first off, I think it is helpful to get a nice warm and fuzzy on what I mean by super maneuverability, because a lot of people tend to see it as either the second coming of Jesus or just a marketing gimmick to impress rubes at air shows with impressive names that sound like anime attacks. Pugachev's Cobra, Kovachur's Bell, Falling Leaf, Jimmy Carter. And the real answer is that super maneuverability can essentially be defined as very controlled stalling / controlled flight beyond angles of attack and envelopes that are not normally achievable. This in and of itself is not necessarily all that helpful either. So I think the most effective way to approach the subject is to consider planes and capabilities on a spectrum. It also might be helpful to think of super maneuverability as being an aspect of plane performance that is distinct and separate from conventional maneuverability. For instance, let's just take 3 of Growling Sidewinder's favorite planes and just compare angle of attack limitations and how they impact the whole dynamic of their matchups. The F-16 is a plane with very good conventional maneuverability. It has very high sustained and initial turn rates for low bleed rates, and because of the engine power, the thrust to weight ratio, it has high gain rates. However, due to the stability limitations, it has a relatively poor maximum angle of attack, and it has a fairly restrictive flight control system. The F-18, on the other hand, is sort of a mixed bag compared to the F-16 in terms of conventional maneuverability, or at least to my understanding, because there are not any publicly available EM diagrams for the F-18 to make really good direct comparisons. But essentially, the F-18 likely has a higher initial turn for an increased bleed rate and also reduced gain rate due to having a lower thrust to weight ratio. However, due to the differences in design, the F-18 has a very well documented advantage at lower airspeeds due to lower wing loading and practically double the angle of attack limit of 50 degrees. When it comes to both of these planes engaging in a guns-only dogfight in training, the F-16 guys will try to ensure that the fight remains at higher speeds and take advantage of the areas where their plane has a clear advantage. At the same time, the F-18 guys will try to make the F-16 uncomfortable where it finds itself slower than it wants to be and fighting in positions where it does not want to be from and is not going to be as capable. For the F-16 guy, he might have to be more aware of the amount of position that he's willing to give up at the start in order to maintain an energy advantage, while the F-18 guy might have to be more conscious about how much energy he is willing to sacrifice in order to gain a position. And just because one plane is good at one thing and another plane is good at another, doesn't mean that every fight will go exactly one way, or even that each pilot will do the same thing every time. There is some psychology to this, where an F-16 pilot, knowing that he is facing an F-18, knowing that the F-18 is probably going to conserve speed early on in anticipation of a conventional game plan, is going to try to throw a wrench in that thought process by doing the opposite and make a really ballsy sacrifice of airspeed in the first turns to gain position to basically say, no, fuck you, I will fight your fight and win because I am just better. This mentality is also why asking fighter pilots about what the best aircraft is totally fucking useless, because the best aircraft is always the one that they happen to fly, and everything else sucks. Anyways, I digress. The F-18 will have advantages once the fight gets to lower airspeeds, and the F-16 will have advantages at higher airspeeds. Both planes are equally matched, or at least they are for this comparison. And if you get both pilots to be objectionable about their airplane and ask them what they would want to be changed about them, the F-16 guy would probably say that he wants to have more AoA and low-speed flight performance of the F-18. And the F-18 guy would probably say that he wants more thrust-to-weight ratio and the high-speed capabilities of the F-16. But if you asked either one of them if they would sacrifice one for the other, they would probably look at you like you have a 3-foot dick growing out of your forehead. And this is where the flanker comes in, or the flanker in theory, because essentially what the flanker probably does, and I say probably because there's no real EM diagram for that, so we can't make direct comparisons that are fully informed, is essentially what the flanker does is it improves on some aspects of both of these planes while not being outright better in every single category. The flanker might not have the high-speed sustained turn rate and energy efficiency of the F-16, and it might not have the outright low-speed sustained turn rate efficiency of the F-18, but it has a high-speed advantage over the F-18 and a low-speed advantage over the F-16. At the same time, what it definitively improves upon over the F-18 is the angle attack limit and having a full range of super maneuverability. And what super maneuverability adds to the flanker is just a greater degree of flexibility. Outside of the fancy airshow stuff, there are tactical applications to increasing the controllability of the plane past the stall. This is something that was very thoroughly studied in the 1990s. It is one of the reasons that the ultimate fighter plane ever, the F-22, features thrust vectoring, and it can do all of the airshow nonsense that the Su-27 can do. What all of the thrust vectoring prototype studies showed when it engaged in mock dogfights was the plane that was equipped with thrust vectoring was more capable than the planes without. For instance, one of the Air Force's takeaways from the F-16 MAT-B program was just the ability to attain higher angles of attack and super maneuverability meant that pilots engaging the super maneuverable plane would have to alter their tactics to take that capability into account. It was also found that even in a 2 versus 1 scenario against conventional planes, that the super maneuverable plane would be able to hang on for longer and be more effective. The other thing that was substantiated was that there was some truth to the fact that overusing or using thrust vectoring too early on in a fight would result in the plane becoming essentially a sitting duck. What the Air Force learned through all of these studies is that thrust vectoring and super maneuverability is a very nice thing to have because it does extend the flight envelope of the plane. So why weren't all of the F-16s upgraded to have thrust vectoring? Well, it's simple. The missile technology caught up to the planes. The introduction and refinement of high off-bore sight missiles essentially made dogfighting amongst fourth generation planes into something that's more or less mutually assured destruction. We have reached the point where IR missiles like the AIM-9X and IRIS-T can shoot down planes that are behind the launching aircraft. There are probably some tactics to counter these missiles, but the margins of error are probably a lot smaller than they used to be. So much so that even ignoring the stealth revolution, that designing a fighter for pure dogfighting capability is incredibly silly in the modern world. That doesn't mean that any air forces stop doing mock dogfights altogether, but rather that the emphasis itself is going to be more on the training value and the proficiencies that it builds, and not its actual tactical impact or application. It's also the same reason that militaries still end up doing bayonet drills, pugil sticks, and hand-to-hand combat drills. Anyways, I've gotten sidetracked for the 30th bajillionth time, so let's digress back to our area of interest and my drunken expertise. So far, I am satisfied with how I have covered instability, flight control systems, and how they are implemented in the game, and War Thunder's modeling decisions. You might not have understood every single thing I've said, and not everything I've said has been perfectly accurate, because this is already a 50-minute long video, and I'm a six-pack in. It's not going to be perfectly accurate. So if you're an aeronautics master degree person, a former Air Force pilot who somehow stumbled upon this in the YouTube algorithm, like, let's treat this with the standard of decency of, this is a War Thunder video. This is not an aeronautics video. What I want to finish up with is why this whole discussion is relevant, and why do I care so much about this, and why should you? So first off, with the introduction of Rafale and Typhoon, we have reached the point in War Thunder where the flight models are implemented with educated guesswork. The actual dynamic between these planes is not going to be representative of their real-life counterparts. For instance, Justin Bronk, a dude who essentially has a PhD in fighter planes, claims that the Rafale has better turn performance below 15,000 feet when compared to the Typhoon. That is not the case in the game. The Typhoon is better in every single performance metric at every single altitude. Furthermore, due to Gaijin's decision to not even remotely accurately model angle of attack limitations, it essentially means that all newer planes are effectively super maneuverable. It means that amongst the planes that we currently have, planes like the F-16, Rafale, and the Eurofighter, they have received considerable buffs in their potential when it comes to dogfighting. It means that areas where you would expect a plane to have an advantage in a certain matchup are just non-existent. This also means that in the future, when planes are added with thrust vectoring, that they might largely be irrelevant, or they will have to be artificially buffed into relevancy. And in Sim, that means we're going to end up with flight models that might more closely resemble Tom Clancy's Hawks than anything that would be capable in real life. This ends up being pretty foreboding for new additions in the future, like the Su-30S and the F-18. With that being said, I don't want to be dooming about this, because we did doom about the Gripen when it was going to be initially added, because people thought that it had poor thrust-to-weight ratio and that it would be irrelevant and it'd just basically be a top-tier F5, and that was not the case. So there is the potential that with the newer planes that Gaijin cooks up some bullshit, and when that bullshit gets cooked up, we will be there to talk about it. Is there any potential for this actually happening? And the answer is no. Zero, zilch, nada, not a chance in hell. Never gonna happen, because leading up to this video, I did go down the Eurofighter rabbit hole. I did make a bug report. It did get accepted, and this is the response I received from the developers. Essentially, the claim is still that accurately implementing any kind of flight control limits would brick mousing, even though the Gripen exists. And therefore, we have no interest in doing it. So for the time being, the Eurofighter will continue to be Cobra capable, and Sim 1 versus 1 will come down to who can better manage wonky flight performance and manual controls, and game the AoA limits at low speeds. It also means that in the future, if there is a competitive SB 1 versus 1 mode that pertains to top tier jets, that anyone who has developed their own third-party flight control system and custom control curves will have an enormous advantage over someone who's just playing the game normally. And from my point of view, I find this rather unfortunate. It also means that a lot of parallels that would exist in real life will not exist in gameplay, or they will not exist in the same way. For instance, the F-18 and the Su-30, even though in real life they have exceptional low-speed flight performance, might be rendered completely irrelevant just by a Eurofighter Typhoon hitting a button, playing manual controls, and just staying under 45 AoA. Anyways, that is a Beer Thunder. That is an hour-long Beer Thunder. I hope that you enjoyed this journey. If you didn't, you should like and subscribe anyway, and then leave a nasty comment about how many errors I made in this hour-long drunken spiel, because I am not a fighter pilot, and I do not have a master's degree in aerospace engineering. There are going to be some errors. If you leave a comment, especially if it's early on when I'm reading them and I have free time, I might actually reply to them. In the future, I don't intend to do as many hour-long videos because, like, it takes a lot of time and effort, and I'm, like, actually in school right now, so it's different. So if you didn't like the video and it's not for you, still like and subscribe. Just, like, stick around. Like, the next video is going to be shorter because I can't keep up this, like, creative schedule. But anyways, that's the video. That's a Beer Thunder. I'm gonna like go like chug a bottle of whiskey and hopefully wake up in the snow or something, because my brain hurts, man.